With us now, National Co-Chair, Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign, former Ohio State Senator Nina Turner, co-host of the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton show, Buck Sexton himself. Nice to see both of you. Buck, I understand that Republicans think, and with good reason, if we're talking about immigration, if the media is talking about it, it doesn't matter what the story is, it's good for Republicans. Do you worry that there is no video, there is no story, that at some point the narrative will turn against Republicans?
Well, I have to say Democrats seem to have learned the lesson of, I'd say, the last month or so, which is that having members of Congress fly down to El Salvador on behalf of a foreign national, illegal alien, MS-13 gang member wasn't quite the PR victory that they were planning on. So they've at least now started to pull on the right heartstrings, or rather try to pull on heartstrings that might get normal people to care. Nobody cares about an MS-13 gang member being deported out of the country if he's here illegally, except for people who hate President Trump and can't be reasoned with. Beyond that, on these issues we're talking about, we don't know why these people were arrested. So inherently, you're looking at videos, and the videos are meant to evoke an emotional reaction. But I think the Democrats forget, and the people that are criticizing this forget, the emotions of the country after 10+ million illegal aliens piling into the country, overwhelmingly doing so under the pretense of false asylum, and flooding the streets of cities like New York and Chicago, billions and billions of taxpayer dollars going to them at a time when there are plenty of Americans, plenty of actual citizens here who could use help and who could use resources. And I think that there's a sense that we're fed up. And I don't think it's going to be as easy to say have AOC at the fence crying and doing the photo ops as it was in previous administrations, because we were so taken advantage of.
Nina, do Democrats need to stop talking about illegal immigrants and making them a cause celeb?
I mean, it can't be the only cause. I think in some ways, Buck and I have some agreement here. Where I disagree is in how this is being done. We must have a level of humanity, even in enforcing our own laws. And I think that's what most people would be concerned about. If I take the African-American community, for example, in polls, the African-American community has said very clearly they're concerned about illegal immigration. They want tougher laws. However, they also said they want people to be treated humanely. And the way African-Americans, using that community as an example, they far outpace other communities in terms of the humanity side. Democrats must answer to why didn't they do anything about immigration when they had the power? Now, that does not mean that the Trump administration should not be criticized or called out, but it's a little bit hypocritical. And I'm not so sure the members of Congress should be the ones doing it. It should probably should be other people doing it, because they look like, sound like hypocrites.
Well, that's nothing new for politicians, right, Buck?
Well, I'm a politician, though.
Look, I've got to say, I mean, yeah.
Go ahead, Buck.
Anyway, I was just going to say what Nina said, I think, is actually all fair-minded on this. I don't have strenuous disagreement with her points, especially that the Biden administration forced the Trump administration's hand, or I should say the Trump campaign, because Trump ran on doing exactly what he's doing, which I know in politics is almost a shock that somebody would say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to deal with the millions of illegals who came in, specifically prioritizing them from a law enforcement perspective. I mean, I know some of the individuals who have been on these ICE raids in the press. I've talked to them, and they know that most of the time they're going after people who are really bad individuals. I mean, not just people that are here illegally, but also have committed serious crimes in addition and are at the top of the list. Now, where it gets a little bit murkier, and to the point about humanity that was made, if somebody is present who is also an illegal, they are also fair game for deportation. And so they might get brought into that, but that is still what the law states. Now, we always want law enforcement to be acting, whether it's ICE or local cops or anybody, to be acting with only the necessary force. But if people are going to kick and scream on the ground and say, I'm not going, when they're in the midst of an ICE arrest, people are going to lay, I mean, the cops are going to lay hands on them, and the law enforcement officers are going to say.
But everybody's not doing that. My concern, Leland and Buck, is that this administration is using this as a way to say we must suspend habeas corpus. we must suspend.
Well, they haven't said we must do it. But
process.
Nina, how do Democrats get a win? How do you get off defense and on offense on this issue?
I'm not here to give the Democratic Party a win. I want to give the American people a win. I want us as a nation to decide how we're going to enforce the laws, what are the laws, have humane immigration reform, and then also not to paint all immigrants, even if they did not come here the legal way. All right. I understand that point. I will concede that point. But not to paint them all as they are vicious criminals and then get other Americans amped up to be violent.
I have this weird feeling about this because I think that there are people who came here. Yes, they came here illegally. They came here a while ago. They have paid taxes. They have built a life here. They are trying to live the American dream. And deporting them in the same way you deport people who came across a year and a half ago and are violent gang members, that just doesn't seem fair at some level to me. But, Buck, I think the question to you is, what happens when Democrats turn this around? Because in terms of getting a win, Democrats put this back on Republicans and say, fine, we'll give you comprehensive border protection. We will shut down the border. We will codify all these things that are executive actions by Donald Trump into law. But in exchange, there have to be people who came here, and they're going to make it make sense. If you're married to an American citizen and you're an illegal immigrant and not having a criminal record, you get to stay. That's an 80-20 issue the other way. What do Republicans do about that?
Well, see, that's at the very end, I think, of the immigration law enforcement timeline and at the bottom of the priorities list, right? The challenge that Democrats have here, and by the way, I think in fairness, you gave Nina, and I think she realizes this, an impossible ask, which is how do Democrats turn this around into a win? Right now,
Well,
the reason they haven't been able to is that I don't think it is possible.
Okay.
Well, okay. I think it's impossible.
No, what I mean by that, Buck.
But if I may.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Go ahead.
No, what I mean by
okay. I was going to say, I mean, when you have 10 plus, we're going over each other again. Sorry about the delay.
This
I'm
is
to
the
chill
delay
out
issue.
Here for a second.
Buck,
you
get 30 seconds.
Nina
gets the last word. Go ahead.
All right. Look, I just wanted to say, you have to look at the 10+ million illegals who came in under Biden alone. That was viewed as a grotesque betrayal of the law, of American sovereignty, of what is right, by the way, for legal Black and Latin American communities in this country. And where do the illegal immigrants overwhelmingly go? Into minority predominant communities. So it's a much broader base, a much broader coalition to get rid of that issue, or to handle that issue of getting rid of the illegal immigration, than I think Democrats recognize until this moment.
All right, Nina, you get the last word.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a failure over several administrations, not just the Biden administration. I would argue that in President Trump's first administration, he didn't do a whole lot. We must look at the geopolitical factors, the push-pull factors that push people to want to come into this country, the role that that America plays in that. And then, Buck, listen, charity starts at home and spreads abroad. Right. So I get that, and I can see that, and the Democrats did this all the wrong way, and I hope that they learn lessons. Leland, as you know, I don't worship at the feet of the Democratic Party.
You do not. I would add, I think people are going to always want to come to America because it's the greatest place on earth. That's just the way it is.
Well, that's the thing. We shouldn't be penalized because we're so awesome, which is why people want to come here.
Well,
and
we
I
don't have universal health care.
It cease to be America if we don't have borders.
Okay. Thank you both very much. Appreciate it. Buck Sexton, Nina Turner, always good, always passionate.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.